Hello dear friends, welcome back again to another video from my YouTube channel. Dear friends, in our previous video we discussed about the agents of pollination. That means we discussed about the pollinators. Agents of pollination means they are the factors that brings the pollination in the plants. And in our previous video we made it very clear that there are two types of agents that performs the pollination, that do the pollination in the plant. One is biotic agent and another one is abiotic agent. In abiotic means non-living agents, biotic means living agents. In abiotic agents, we have two types of abiotic factors that bring the pollination in the plants. One is wind and another one is water. If the transfer of pollen grains from anther to the stigma is done by a wind, then it is called as the anemophily. If the pollination is done by the water, then it is called as hydrophily. If the insects, birds, snails, bats, ants, if they carry the pollen grains from anther to the stigma, then simply it is called as zoophily. Based on the pollinating agents, there are three types of pollinators. One is anemophily, that is pollination by wind. Another one is hydrophily, pollination by water. And the last one is zoophily, that means pollination with the help of the animals. Now, what is this Anemophilous flower? Anemophily means pollination by wind. Then what is Anemophilous flower? Anemophilous flower is nothing but the flower which is dependent on wind for its pollination. Such flowers are called as Anemophilous flowers. Now, in the same way, what is the Hydrophilous flower? Hydrophilous flower means it is a flower which is completely dependent on water for its pollination. In the same way, can we able to define what is a Zoophilous flower? Zoophilous flower means it is a flower which is completely dependent on animals for their pollination, and it is also called as Entomophilous flower. Entomology means study of insects. Entomophilous flower means it is a flower which is completely dependent on insects for their pollination. We have three types of flowers. One is Anemophilous flower, which is dependent on wind for its pollination. Hydrophilous flower, it is dependent on water for its pollination. Zoophilous flower, it is dependent on animals for its pollination. Now, let us understand what are the characteristic features of Anemophilous, Hydrophilous and Zoophilous flower. Now, why it is necessary to study them? Is it important for our examination? Is it important for our competitive exams and board exams? Yes, my dear friends. One question will be definitely there in your competitive exams from this concept, because the characters of Anemophilous flower, based on this concept, the question was asked in 2010 and 2011 AIPMT examination. And the characters of the Hydrophilous flower, based on this concept, in Kerala CET 2014 there was a question. And here, characters of Zoophilous flower, one question was there in the NEET examination in 2017. And by the end of this video, we are going to understand whether the self-pollination is better or cross-pollination is better. Self-pollination versus cross-pollination. Let us try to understand which type of pollination is better for a plant. Based on this concept also, there was a question in JIPMER 2018. What is this JIPMER? It seems to be a very new word for you people. JIPMER means Jawaharlal Nehru Institute of Postgraduate Medicine, Medical Science, Education and Research. It is a very top level medical examination. In that examination, based on this concept, there was a question in 2018. Now, let us begin our video with the characters of Anemophilous flower. It is very simple. It's very interesting. What are the characters of wind pollinated flowers? If the pollen grains are carried by the wind current, that means definitely the pollen grain should be should be light weighted. Light weighted. If the pollen grains are with heavy weight, suppose अगर पोलन ग्रेन्स 10 किलो का है, समझो 10 किलो का 20 किलो का पोलन ग्रेन है, तो हवा में उड़ के जा सकता है क्या? बिल्कुल भी नहीं जा सकता. इन द सेम वे, if the pollen grains are light weighted, then they are easily carried by the wind current. That is why pollen grain should be light weighted. This is the first characteristic feature of Anemophilous flower. Then the second characteristic feature of Anemophilous flower is the stigma. Stigma should be large. Why the stigma should be large? Pollen grains are simply carried by the air current, and the stigma is very, very small. Suppose the stigma is very, very small, then where the pollen grain should land? So to land the pollen grain, we have a large platform. To receive the floating pollen grain in the air, we need to have a large platform, large stigma. Stigma should be large, feathery, sometimes sticky. Why the feathery and sticky stigma should be there in the Anemophilous flower? The pollen grains are simply floating in the wind, and the pollen grains are dropped on the stigma. To hold the pollen grains tightly, the stigma should be feathery and sticky. To hold the pollen grain or to stuck the pollen grain on the stigmatic surface, the stigma should be feathery and sticky. It is the second characteristic feature of Anemophilous flower. Then the third characteristic feature is very common. The Anemophilous flower, they always expose their anthers and the stigma so that the pollen grains are simply carried by the wind. So exposed stigma to receive the wind pollinated pollen grain, and exposed stigma and anther. Anther should be exposed and stigma should be exposed. Both of them, they should be exposed. Then only the Anemophilous flower can perform the pollination with the help of wind. Then the next one is the pollen grains should be of enormous amount. The plant should produce, or rather the flower should produce the large number of pollen grains. Large number of pollen grains are produced. Large number of pollen grains produced. Why the Anemophilous? Why for an Anemophilous flower the large number of pollen grains should be produced? Because when the number of the pollen grains increases, that enhances the chances of pollination. That is why the Anemophilous flower, they always produces large number of pollen grains. And lastly, what are the examples for Anemophilous flower? Most of the grasses are the example for Anemophilous flower. Maize is the example for Anemophilous flower. Sorghum, jawar. Sorghum, common name is jawar. This is the example for the Anemophilous flower. Based on this, there was a question in the AIPMT 2010 and 2011, my dear friends. Now, let us move on to the next concept. What are the characteristic features of Hydrophilous flower? What is Hydrophilous flower? It is a flower which is completely dependent on water for its pollination. Here, the first character, it also produces light weighted pollen grains. If the flowers, they produces heavy weighted pollen grains, they simply sunk into the water. That is why the pollen grain should be light weighted. Second characteristic feature is pollen grains are long. Pollen grains are long and ribbon-like. ribbon like, so that they can easily float on the surface of the water. And the third characteristic feature is stigma. Stigma should be large and feathery. Stigma should be large and feathery to catch the pollen grains easily. They are the characteristic feature. Now, what are the examples of hydrophilous flower? Vallisneria. Vallisneria is the example, and this Vallisneria plant is completely dependent on water for its pollination. Hydrilla. Hydrilla is the plant which is dependent on water for its pollination. Then Zostera. Zostera is the plant which is dependent on water for its pollination. But most of the times in the competitive exams, the question was asked based on the Vallisneria, because this Vallisneria plant, it is very intelligent plant. It is very smart plant. It is very wise plant. How is that Vallisneria do the pollination? Say for example, if this is the pond. If this is a pond. And in this pond, we have many aquatic plants and aquatic animals. Suppose this is the water surface. This is water surface. Vallisneria is a submerged plant. They are the roots of the Vallisneria. Here we have the leaves of the Vallisneria. They are all the leaves of the Vallisneria. Vallisneria produces two types of flowers, male flower and female flower separately. Suppose if this is the male flower, here we have the male flower where we have only the anthers located. They are the anthers. This is the male flower. Male flower. Whereas the female flower, it has got a long stalk here. It has got a long stalk, and ultimately this female flower reaches the water surface. This is the female flower. That means definitely we have here the stigma, style and the ovary. This is the female flower. This is the stigma, style and the ovary. This is female flower. If you carefully look towards the male and the female flower, male flower is inside the water, whereas female flower reaches the surface of the water. Male flower is within the water, whereas female flower is floating on the surface of the water. Male flower definitely produces the pollen grains. Here the pollen grains are produced. Suppose they are all the pollen grains. They are all the pollen grains produced by the male flowers. Let us label them. They are the pollens. And one more very important thing, my dear friends, in hydrophilous flower, pollen grains are covered with a waxy layer. Pollen grains are covered with a layer of waxy layer, that is called as mucilage. Mucilage layer that protects the pollens from wetting. Here the pollen grains are produced inside the water. To prevent the pollen grains from wetting, the pollen grains are covered with a mucilage layer. It is also a very, very important concept. This concept was asked in Kerala CET 2014. Pollen grains are protected from wetting by a cover, by a waxy layer. That waxy layer is nothing but a mucilage layer. Here, now coming back to our original discussion here, Vallisneria has got two types of flowers. Male flower is within the water, whereas female flower is floating on the surface of the water. Male flower produces the pollen grains, and these pollen grains are light weighted. They easily come to the surface. they easily reaches the surface of the water, and by the help of water current, they ultimately reach the stigma here. That means the transfer of pollen grains from anther to the stigma by water, it is called as hydrophily. So Vallisneria is the classic example given for 12th NCERT syllabus. This is about Vallisneria. Now moving to the next concept, that is the Zoophilous flower. As we have discussed earlier, Zoophilous means it is a flower that is dependent on animals for its pollination. The Zoophilous flowers, first characteristic feature is flowers are large size. Flowers are of large size. Then why it is necessary to have a large size flower for a Zoophilous type of pollination or for a zoophily? Zoophily means the pollination with the help of insects, and insect should land on the flower. Insects should enter the flower. Sometimes in ornithophily, birds should enter the flower for pollination. That is why the flower should be of large size. The plant, for example, there is a plant called as Amorphophallus. Amorphophallus. This Amorphophallus is very, very important for your competitive exams, my dear friends, because the largest flower in the entire plant kingdom is Amorphophallus. It produces approximately 6 feet tall. 6 feet tall flower. That means approximately of my feet. 6 feet approximately of my height. 6 feet tall flower is being produced by Amorphophallus plant. The flower should be of large size. It is the very, very important characteristic feature of Zoophilous. Then the second very important characteristic feature of Zoophilous flower is Zoophilous flowers, they are of bright color. Flowers consist of bright color petals. Why the flowers they consist of bright color petals? So that they can attract the animals for pollination, for attraction purpose, for showy purpose, for exhibiting themselves to the animals. The flowers are of bright color. Then flowers produces fragrance. Flowers produces fragrance. Most of the flowers, they are with a fragrant, and that fragrance is because to attract the pollinators for pollination. Then the next characteristic feature is flowers produces sweet, sugary liquid. Sweet sugary liquid, which is commonly called as nectar. And this nectar, in Kannada it is called as makaranda, nectar. Flowers, they produces nectar. Which flowers they produces the nectar? The flowers which are dependent on animals for their pollination. To attract the animals for the pollination, they produces nectar, they produces fragrance, they are of bright colored petals, and the plants are consisting of large size flowers. They are all the characteristic feature. Now, this nectar is actually a reward for a pollinator. Nectar is not at all useful for a plant. Nectar is not utilized by the plant. In fact, this nectar is produced by a plant as a reward to the pollinator. Why the reward is given? Because the animals, they do the pollination for plant, and plant in return, it will give a reward in the form of nectar. Nectar is a reward given to the animals which do pollination, it is a reward. Now, the very important concept among all these points is there is a plant which is called as yucca. There is a plant which is called as yucca. There is a plant which is called as yucca. It is a plant. Yucca is dependent. It is dependent on a moth. Moth means it's a fly, just like a butterfly. Yucca plant is dependent on a moth, and the name of the moth is Pranuba. Pranuba moth. There is a relationship between yucca plant and a Pranuba moth. What is that relationship? This relationship is called as symbiotic relationship. Symbiotic relationship means give and take policy. Symbiotic relationship. Yucca plant will give something to the Pranuba, and in return Pranuba will help the yucca. Now what is that symbiotic relationship? It is a symbiotic relationship between a plant and a moth, a plant and an animal. There is a relationship between plant and an animal. What is the plant? Yucca is the plant. What is the animal? Pranuba is the animal. Both are dependent on one another. Both are interdependent. Pranuba, it lay its egg. Pranuba is an insect. Pranuba is a moth. Pranuba lays the egg in the locules of yucca plant. Where are the locules located? Locules are located inside the ovary, my dear friends. That means Pranuba is laying its egg in the ovary of yucca plant, and yucca plant in return gives protection to the egg, and Pranuba in return do the pollination for yucca plant. Pranuba do the pollination for yucca, and yucca plant in return it protect the eggs from the enemies of Pranuba moth. This type of relationship is very, very common, and this relationship is very famous in the entire biological world. Yucca plant and Pranuba moth. Don't forget these two names. They are very important for competitive exams. Now, after understanding the three types of flowers, Anemophilous, Hydrophilous and Zoophilous, and their characteristic features, now lastly we'll discuss about the self-pollination and the cross-pollination. To differentiate between these two, or to judge which pollination is better for a plant, we have to have the knowledge of what is the self-pollination and what is cross-pollination. To understand that, here I am drawing a situation. For example, here we have a plant. Suppose this is a mango plant. This is a mango plant. Consider this is mango plant A. Here we have one more mango plant. Suppose this is mango plant B. Both are mango. But this mango plant A, it is producing small fruits, but sweet fruits. Here the fruits are small, but they are sweet. Fruits are small, size is very small, but the taste is sweet. Here in this plant B, mango, the mango is large size mango, but the taste is bitter. For example, it is large mango and bitter mango. Large mango, bitter mango. And this plant is producing a flower here. Here also we have the flower. Here we have the anthers, stigma, anthers, stigma. Suppose you people can answer this. Here from this anther, the pollen grains are dropped on the stigma of the same flower, can we consider this as a self-pollination or cross-pollination? Transfer of pollen grains from anther to the stigma of same flower. Is it self-pollination or cross-pollination? Yes, it is self-pollination. It is self-pollination. If the pollen grains from this anther, they are dropped on the stigma of this plant, then definitely it is a cross-pollination. Cross-pollination. Now, what is the result of self-pollination and what is the result of cross-pollination? Here, after pollination, the fertilization takes place. After fertilization, this flower, in future, it get converted into fruit. Now, how will be that fruit which is produced by a self-pollination? This fruit will be definitely of small size, but the taste is sweet. But the taste is sweet. Then what is the result of cross-pollination? The pollen grains from this plant is dropped on the stigma of B plant. The pollen grains of A plant are dropped on the stigma of B plant. How is the B plant? B plant is producing large fruit. B plant is producing bitter fruit. How is the plant A? Plant A produces small size fruit, but the fruits are very tasty. They are sweet. If the pollen grains from this plant are dropped on the stigma of this B plant, then what may be the possibility? What may be the possible results we can get? The fruits may be large, sweet. Fruits may be large and sweet. Fruits may be small and bitter. Fruits may be small and bitter. That means they are the two possible results that we can get from the cross-pollination. Here, out of these two, if you visit a market, which type of fruits do you want to prefer to purchase? Whether you prefer to purchase large and sweet fruits, or do you prefer to purchase small and bitter fruits? Definitely, my dear friends, you are going to purchase large size sweet fruits. This large and sweet fruit is possible in self-pollination or in cross-pollination. In which type of pollination? This superior variety is possible. It is possible only in cross-pollination, my dear friends. That is why when we compare the self-pollination with the cross-pollination, cross-pollination is always better than the self-pollination. Sometimes in some plants, self-pollination is also very useful. Self-pollination maintains the pure line. But continuous self-pollination leads to the inbreeding depression. It leads to the sterility in the plant. Plant is no more fertile in future if it is continuously self-pollinated. That is why while comparing the self-pollination with the cross-pollination, cross-pollination is always better than the self-pollination. That is why most of the plants, they prefer to do the cross-pollination rather than the self-pollination. That is why some of the plants, they are strictly doing the cross-pollination. We'll understand what are the strategies, what are the plans, what are the adaptations, what are the modifications done in the plant to do the cross-pollination under the heading of outbreeding devices in our next video. I hope you people have got an idea about the entire concept. If you like this video, please hit the like button and share among your friends and subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thank you so much.